Hi, this week we're bringing you something a little bit different. It's called Shocked, and it's a new podcast from our friends at the University of Chicago's Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. Shocked is about facing the reality that a warmer world is here. Now what? Axios journalist Amy Harder and new Chicago economist Michael Greenstone share new ways of thinking about climate change and cutting-edge solutions to do things like win the battery race, use AI to predict polluters and the weather, and reduce pollution through markets. Markets. That's what this episode digs into. Here we go.
It's really hard to find ways to protect the environment that make everyone happy. But there is a solution that people from all ends of the political spectrum love.
I'm an environmentalist. Always have been from my earliest days growing up. That is not inconsistent with being a businessman, nor is it with being a conservative.
And it came from the Republican Party in the first Bush years. This is George H.W. Bush giving a speech in Detroit when he was first running for president.
Some say these problems are too big, that it's impossible for an individual or even a nation as great as ours to solve the problem of global warming or the loss of forest or the deterioration of our oceans. My response is simple. It can be done, and we must do it.
When I met with Republicans, I emphasized the cost savings. And when I met with Democrats, I emphasized the emission reductions that we would achieve.
This is Jeff Homestead, lawyer, longtime Republican, worked for both the George H.W. and George W. Bush White Houses, advisor to the Romney campaign. He's telling me about his days working in the EPA for George W. Bush. He and the head of the agency were on Capitol Hill trying to get buy-in for an environmental law.
And I remember after a few of these meetings, she looked at me and she said, "Sometimes I think you're talking about two different programs." And I sort of laughed and I said, "Well, I just know who my audience is and I'm telling the truth to both people, but I'm just emphasizing different things."
Today on the show, Jeff is going to take us back to the 90s, when the first Bush White House was on the cutting edge of pollution control and how that innovation is still changing the world. Specifically, how to use a marketplace to stop pollution and why it is so hard to get one started in the U.S. for carbon dioxide, the gas that we need to take on in order to slow climate change.
As the nations of the world grow, they burn increasing amounts of fossil fuels. And that gives off carbon dioxide, which acts as a blanket, insulating the earth.
I'm Amy Harder, and you're listening to Shocked. Today, markets. I'm going to start with the story of how the market approach to curbing emissions came to be. It's the story of cap and trade. It was created in the late 80s, and in the beginning, it was controversial. Jeff Homestead was in a lot of ways at the center of the whole debate. Here's how he got there. Just a few years out of law school, Jeff was headed to New York for a new job. He thought maybe he'd end up on Wall Street.
And out of the blue, really, I had a call from a classmate of mine in law school who asked me if I would be interested in interviewing for a job in the White House counsel's office in the George H.W. Bush administration.
Jeff was surprised but flattered. The job was unique. His new boss wanted to know if he had what it takes to stomach a lot of regulations.
He asked me if I'd be willing to spend, maybe half of my time on regulatory issues. And I didn't have any great interest or enthusiasm, but I wasn't going to tell him that because it was the opportunity to work in the White House. Of course, I took it, and within just a few months, I was spending probably 90% of my time on regulatory issues.
On the campaign trail, George H.W. Bush promised a presidency that would take the environment seriously. Jeff was going to be part of making that happen.
And he had specifically campaigned on the idea that the Clean Air Act needed to be modernized. The Clean Air Act is a combination of dozens of different types of regulatory programs. And one of the things that fascinated me in the White House was understanding which ones actually were the most effective and efficient. and which ones weren't, and including some that were sort of, in my view, unnecessarily burdensome.
Yeah, it's fair to say that the Republican Party is known for not being into regulation. There's this idea that less regulation means smaller government, which is a big talking point. But Jeff offered a surprising reason for the first Bush's focus on regulations, which is just that it was familiar.
I think it was unusual to have a president and many of his senior advisors who were so intensely interested and involved in regulatory issues, who understood, sort of the detailed nitty-gritty of regulations. And that's not normally what people in the White House have.
The Bush White House was stacked with experts on regulations. If George H.W. Bush was going to be known as the environmental president, he had to take on the hot-button environmental issue of that time, acid rain. Coal-fired power plants were sending something like 16 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the sky every year. It was a point of contention between Canada and the United States.
It was well understood that sulfur dioxide emissions from the burning of coal in power plants was acidifying many lakes in the east, especially in the Adirondacks, was having impacts on the health of forests. And so there had been a lot of controversy and litigation over that, and including it was an issue, a foreign policy issue, because the Canadians were very concerned about it.
In fact, when President Reagan visited Canada after his first election, Canadians protesting against acid rain hounded him the entire visit. The first event was speeches outside the legislature in front of a crowd. The Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, yes, Justin Trudeau's dad, gave one, and then Reagan gave one. And the Canadians interrupted Reagan throughout the speech with their shouting. You can hear it in the background. After Trudeau and Reagan left the podiums to go to their next event, waving and walking towards their black cars, Trudeau stops, turns, and hustles back up to the podium.
Hey guys, when I go to the United States, I'm not met with these kind of signs. The Americans have some beefs against us too.
George H.W. Bush's administration was going to do better.
The waiting period for action on acid rain is over, and I, as president, will be ready to move.
One physical solution at the time to combat emissions was something called a scrubber. Contrary to its name, it's not a big scrub brush or anything like that. It's a physical or chemical process that neutralizes the sulfur dioxide and keeps it from going into the air. Great tool, but it would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars to install that technology on a power plant. At the time, the government's approach to cutting pollution was telling power plant operators, hey, you have to use this specific tool.
So they would say, you're required to install a scrubber, you're required to install this type of pollution control equipment. And so they would mandate exactly what you needed to install and how you needed to operate it.
This method was called command and control. Command and control was not something George H.W. Bush wanted to continue.
The old tradition of command and control regulation is not the answer.
Jeff's new boss in the Bush White House was a tall, lanky man with very thick eyebrows named C. Boyden Gray. He started broaching a new market-based solution.
He was a very interesting fellow for many reasons, but he certainly was a conservative Republican, but he also had contacts in the environmental community.
Gray's idea was, let's stop telling people what to do. If the whole country is emitting 16 million tons, and that's too much pollution, we'll give each power plant a share of a little less of that 16 million. All they have to do is stay under the cap that we give them. The power company can reduce their emissions by installing those scrubbers. They can buy coal with less sulfur content. They can invent something totally new. It's up to them. As long as they stay below their cap, it does not matter. Here's where things pick up. The government did set a penalty for exceeding the cap, $2,000 at the beginning. It's gone up since then. And then they set up a market where power plant operators could buy and sell allowances at a far lower rate than that fine. So if one power plant got its emissions below its allowance, for instance, they emitted 10 tons less than they normally would, it's not just great job. That plant then got to sell the rest of its allowances, those 10 extra tons, to a plant scrambling to stay under its cap. So if you can cut your emissions, you can also make money off of your competitor by trading with them. Kind of cool.
When they give you an incentive to reduce your pollution, then people are much more interested in finding ways to do that as cost effectively as possible.
And this was the cap and trade system. Environmentalists didn't love the idea.
It was called a license to pollute. Rather than controlling their emissions, you were giving them a license to pollute.
Jeff's boss, Seaboard and Gray, was on it.
He actually developed a relationship with the head of the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, that was also interested in market-based mechanisms for reducing air pollution. The Environmental Defense Fund that was willing to sort of stand up and support it from the perspective of environmental groups.
It worked.
Today, I am very proud, on behalf of everyone here, to sign this Clean Air Bill, Clean Air Act of 1990. This landmark legislation will reduce air pollution each year by 56 billion pounds. That's 224 pounds for every man, woman, and child in America. We will make the 1990s the era for clean air.
In 1995, the cap and trade system took effect. And it worked. Across the country, acid rain emissions fell by 3 million tons a year. Jeff, who helped his bosses put the plan together, is still surprised by how effective it was. But he thinks a big reason why cap and trade is so effective is that it builds off human nature to be both competitive and creative.
I think when it comes to regulations, companies, like people, don't like being told what to do. Thou shalt install this scrubber, and thou shalt meet this emission limit, and you have to monitor X, Y, and Z, and you have to do all these things. On the other hand, when they give you an incentive to reduce your pollution, then people are much more interested in finding ways to do that as cost effectively as possible.
That's a very lovely reason for its success. Another reason, it was very easy to enforce.
And in many programs, there are disputes and litigation over whether someone is complying or not. And you would think, well, isn't that normally pretty cut and dried? And the answer is no. A lot of times it's not in these regulatory programs. But with the acid rain program, every coal-fired power plant was required to have continuous emission monitors. But EPA knew on an ongoing basis what the emissions were from every coal-fired power plant in the country. And every power plant knew that too. And so it's very simple to determine whether you're in compliance. There was really never any dispute about it. You had a relatively small staff of people that were implementing the program and were achieving 100% compliance, and they were achieving it at a cost that was much less than anybody had predicted, because it really did unleash the kind of creativity that people had hoped for.
And Americans invented it. Exactly what Bush was going for.
It's fair to say that Americans invented cap and trade as a mechanism for controlling air pollution.
After the break, cap and trade travels the world.
We got best cleanest city in India for the third time consecutively.
If you're enjoying the discussions we're having on this show, there's another University of Chicago Podcast Network show that you should check out. It's called Big Brains. Big Brains brings you the stories behind the pivotal scientific breakthroughs and research that are reshaping our world. Change how you see the world and keep up with the latest academic thinking with Big Brains, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
Since Americans created the cap and trade program in the 1980s, The system has been adapted all over the world. In 2012, it landed in Surat, India, a city with a long history of trade, thanks to its location on the coast of the Arabian Sea.
सूरत का जो पूरा हिस्ट्री देखे,
if you look at the entire history of Surat, that even in the 1600s, big ships used to come here from outside. Surat has always been a hub of textiles.
टेक्सटाइल का जो हब था वो बहुत पहले से है सूरत में.
This is Jitender Vikaria.
मेरा नाम जीतू भाई वखारिया है.
My name is Jeetu Bhai Vakharia. My business is textile processing, dyeing and printing.
इंडस्ट्री मैंने
He goes by Jitu Bai. He is the leader of a textile trade group in Surat and has his own textile business. Kaushik Deb, the director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago in Delhi, helped put us in touch with Jitu Bai and translated for me.
I'm Kaushik Deb and very happy to help. Jeetu Bhai is a wonderful person and I worked with him on the cap and trade project here in Surat.
पूरे नॉर्थ गुजरात से महसाना से
People from all over North Gujarat, Mehsana, even Kathiawar and Kutch came and settled here. And Surat is such that they could get some work or the other. So out of all the people who came, rarely anyone went back. And the ones who stayed, they called more over. Punjabis, Marwadis, Kathiawadis, and from UP and Bihar. So in a way, Surat has become like a mini India.
सूरत एक मिनी इंडिया जैसा.
Almost 100,000 people in Surat earn their living working in textiles. Picture it. Weaving, spinning, dyeing, cutting, packing. All of this fabric gets shipped around the world. In the US, it might show up in Walmart or Michael's. They also make a lot of saris. Jitu Bai told me that in a radius of about 30 kilometers, more than 400 companies work in the textile industry in some capacity. This also means that there is a lot of pollution. Jitu Bai is a total booster for Surat, and he recognizes that the pollution might be one of the only things that's not great about his city.
क्या है कि इतने सारे लोग
If so many people have come here to earn money and then seeing the pollution, they run away.
हैं भाग जाए, ऐसा यहाँ पे
The air pollution largely comes from coal. You can see it. Jitu Bai explained this using an example from his
हो
childhood.
जाएगा. महीने
When I was small, there was no gas to cook. There also was no kerosene to cook. People would use firewood. And my grandmother would say to my mother, a yellow flame will not cook anything. Do something to get a blue flame.
वो ब्लू कर दे उसको.
That was in my mind. I used to closely observe everything in the factory. I thought if black smoke came out, ultimately it's unburnt coal.
अनबर्न कोल ही जा रहा.
If I explained that to someone, he'd also agree. So we started an environmental cleaning system.
एनवायरमेंट क्लीनिंग सिस्टम चालू किया.
Jitu Bai was part of an early effort to cut the amount of pollution coming from smokestacks, and for good reason. Burning coal puts a lot of particulate matter in the air, small materials that can get into the lungs and bloodstream. Not all of it comes from the textile industry, but all of the industries in Surat are subject to pollution regulations. And before 2019, they were subject to that strict command and control style system. Jitu Bai explained how high the stakes were. Factories had emissions limits, and if an inspector came into a factory and said something was wrong or over the limit, they could shut the factory down completely.
कोई स्पेसिफिक कंप्लेंट जाती थी पॉल्यूशन कंट्रोल बोर्ड.
If a specific complaint went to the Pollution Control Board, a man would come to check it out. Then you'd wait for 3 or 4 days to find out if the closure order will come. A closure order meant that the factory would be shut for 2, 3, 4 weeks. If a factory is closed for a month, then think about the loss one suffers.
If you are not in compliance, you are shut down. This means laying off your employees, you have to pay lawyers and go to court while you try to get reopened. Industry did not like these regulations, and the relationship between factory owners and inspectors wasn't great. And the members of his organization were terrified of closure. But it was the only system they had. If you met Jitu Bai back in his student days, you might not think he was destined for leadership. The thing he paid attention to most was cricket.
इतना ब्रिलियंट नहीं था,
Now, I was not brilliant in studies at all, what we call a doba. I was like that. I felt that I wasted my time in playing cricket because I did not make it to the higher leagues and spend time just playing.
His coach was a famous retired player, R.M. Desai, nicknamed Tiny. At the time Jitubai was in school, there were protests against the cost of living that he participated in, and he was advised to get out of town to avoid being beaten by police. He went back to Surat and got straight into the textile business, and he kept Tiny's cricket advice in mind.
One thing that he taught us, matches can go on, practice goes on. Even if you are out and sitting, your focus should constantly be on the ball. The connection between the ball and the eyes will help you understand how the ball moves. That attention is good during batting, during fielding, everything. So what he taught me about focusing on the ball, I made my work ethic, focusing on perfecting the setting, the printing. Sometimes I used to work here in the factory. I did not even go home at night.
But once he became serious about business, he became a perfectionist and a leader. He became an expert on the chemical processes in dyeing. He had innovations in sari manufacturing, and he saw the sustainability of his industry as a reflection of his success.
Dyeing painting mein main 77, 78 se
In the early days, my struggle was for survival. After the fight for survival was over, I thought I should be amongst the best in industry. Then I got fame, and after the fame, I had more responsibility. So the question was, how would industry become more sustainable?
He got involved in a water treatment system. One of the great things about Surat is that it had fresh water supply from the river. But in the summer, industry was competing with drinking water.
In 2010, I talked about it with the commissioner, sir. I said, you give it to us after recycling, we'll filter it. In those days, they were not ready to accept it. He said, we'll ask you to sign an agreement. I said, I'll write anything you want. You can take my arm and leg for it. But they also came around to the fact that we'll definitely do what we said. We've now been filtering water for so many years. I kind of single-handedly created this water network in Pandisera. This is a success story.
So, when he heard about an idea that could cut down on air pollution and closures, he was all in. With its business culture and pollution, Surat was a good place for cap and trade's next evolution, cutting out the particulate matter that comes from coal. They were helped by someone you may have heard of.
Dr. Michael Greenstone.
So we began actually kind of in sadness. I had taken a year away from academia to work in the Obama White House. It seemed like the United States was going to have a cap and trade program or a pollution market for carbon dioxide to forcefully confront climate change. And I was very excited to have an opportunity to work on that. And the bill, and people don't remember this, but actually there was a race between the health Obamacare and cap and trade.
I remember that.
Probably you do, but you're also in the energy nerd tribe. The cap and trade passed through the House first, and then kind of people lost momentum, and it died in the Senate. And anyway, so my time kind of came and went, and I went back to academia. I was a little bit sad about that, and I was re-engaging with my research life. And one of the first things I did is I was like, I want to get going again on India work. And cap and trade was in the front of my mind.
But this wasn't for carbon dioxide.
The great thing about cap and trade, and I think some people think about it only in particular, for particular pollutants, is it's in baseball, they call it a 5-tool athlete. It can do anything. So it can be used for any pollutant. And so I was like, they got a huge pollution problem today for conventional air pollution. They're going to be enormous polluters of CO2. If they're interested in using cap and trade for carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, wonderful. But, that might not be today. That might be tomorrow. In the meantime, can we get this tool to work in India? And so we went and met with the minister, and he was like, this is a terrific idea. The states are the ones who really enforce it. I'm going to set you up with 3 states. And we went and knocked on doors and kind of pursued it with a bunch of different states. And it ended up, in Gujarat, they were the most interested in this. And so one thing led to another, and we were advising the Gujarat Pollution Control Board on how to devise a pollution market, and something that they hadn't done and the industries hadn't done.
About Michael, I couldn't even understand his pronunciation before. I felt like they were rich people from a well-developed country and we are from an underdeveloped country. So at the beginning, when they asked us to do something, there was some resistance.
We had to first develop standards for how you measure the particulate air pollution that comes out of the stack, and then find the right devices to do that measurement. We ran mock trading games with industry.
We would sit and discuss, what should happen in the industry. Then slowly we found a way.
And we worked with the regulators to get comfortable with it. And it was this kind of massive project involving all kinds of different skills and legal skills and political skills and technical skills. And eventually, everyone was kind of tuned up and ready to go.
You wouldn't believe it, the sugar mills got involved, the chemical mills, as well as the yarn dye mills. So it's not just our textile mills. There was every kind of people, even though some sectors had a lower share, but everyone was involved in it.
And we said, but we would like to run this as a randomized control trial because we love research and we love learning about things. And so there had never been an experimental evaluation of a cap and trade program anywhere in the world.
And without the control, you don't actually know how well.
You don't know exactly how it worked. It was a super simple idea. And so we took the 300 firms, put their names in a hat, picked out 150, and you're you guys are going in the market, and 150, you're going to just be regulated just regular way you were. And then we tracked what happened over time. It worked better than my wildest imagination. I would say there are probably 3 top-line results. The first is it's very hard to regulate plants. And I like to say darkness or opacity is the polluter's friend. And so the status quo system of regulation was that the regulator who was understaffed could only get to each plant once or twice a year, and they would take a reading for 15 or 20 minutes. With cap and trade, you have continuous monitoring. So they know what's coming out of the stack every second. And what we found was that in the status quo, at any point in time, a third of the plants were out of compliance with the standard. But in the cap and trade market, they were in compliance 99.5% of the time. So just on the basic thing, can you enforce the law that you have? It was smashing success. The second main result is it reduced emissions by the regulated plants by about 20 to 30%. And then the third, and it's very rare in life that you can have a win-win. You can usually, I'll gain something here and I'll lose something there. It reduced the cost of firms' compliance costs by about 12%. So basically, the regulator was better able to enforce their laws. Pollution went down, people benefited, and the polluters benefited because their compliance costs went down.
Before, there were many closures in the industry. In the last 4-5 years, since the emission trading system was put in place in 2019, there are none.
This almost seems too good to be true. So is Surat an outlier in an otherwise lackluster evidence of cap and trade?
No, there's a total article of faith, but I think there was this very strange thing but normal human thing. Oh, well, that's from over there. It's not going to work here. And what really caught my attention was it served as proof of concept. Once that proof of concept became known, it went from me and my colleagues knocking on doors, trying to get other states interested within India, to totally reverse. People were knocking on our doors. And so from the start, all of the control plants were put into the market. In fact, some of them had been lobbying the regulator. Hey, why can't we be in the market? Why do we have to be regulated the old way?
So there was an interesting part in the beginning of the paper. you talk about a regulator coming down hard. Is there a story there?
Yes. So there is an excellent story. For those of us who wonder where markets come from. So pollution markets are a creation of governments. What they effectively do is this convert pollution emissions into money, because to pollute, you then have to have a permit, and that permit has economic value. And so it's effectively this magic trick where pollution becomes money. So at the end of the first compliance period, all the firms had to hand in, all the plants had to hand in permits for all the pollution that they had done that there was now a record of. And two firms that were pretty big and I would say familiar with leadership, and we're like, no, we're not doing it. Yeah, we did this much pollution and we're not going to hand in any permits. It's tough. And the regulator called me.
You, okay.
Or we had one of our regular check-ins, and he's like, what am I supposed to do? These guys are refusing to hand in the permits. And I said, well, remember, we've been working on this for 5 years. They are questioning your authority. And if you let them off right now, in the second period, nobody's going to have any permits, turn in any permits. The whole thing is legal foundation is going to fall apart. And he's like, okay. And we had written rules for what would happen, and effectively you'd have to be fined like 10 times the value of a permit if you didn't hold the right number of permits. And he just applied the fine, and never again was there a problem. And so it was like, this is how pollution markets work. It's kind of a rule of law point. It's a rule of law point.
What did they do when they had to pay the big fine?
So we had come up with a clever thing, because we were worried about this, that every plant in the market had to post a bond. And so we didn't actually have to go after them. The Gujarat Pollution Control Board just subtracted it from the amount of money they'd posted. And they got the message. Look, what's the problem in India or anywhere else? The regulator and government is trying to find a balance between the need for economic growth and jobs and a clean environment. And so these are big firms. What do I mean by that? They hired a lot of people. And they were also, I would say, naturally as a big firm, have lots of interactions with government and were well known to government. And so I think when they said we're complaining, their word would be taken a little bit more seriously than maybe Amy's fly-by-night shirt making operation.
So it's kind of like the ExxonMobil of the India power market, not to single out.
Well, they were also the right people to do it. If the firms were looking to kill the market, these are the firms. If the whole set of firms in the market looking to kill the market, these are the right guys to do it.
So the study's title is, quote, Can Pollution Markets Work in Developing Countries? Experimental Evidence from India. That really rolls off the tongue. I applaud you for the name.
Do you know how long and viciously me and my co-authors fought about that title?
Definitely. And now you can ask ChatGPT to help.
Yes.
So it'll be simpler. So let's answer the question of your title. Can they?
The answer is yes. Pollution markets can work in developing countries. And I think that has served as a proof of concept that there really is great demand out there for finding ways to balance the need for economic growth with a clean environment.
And returning to Jitubai, this was a point that he made several times. If people have a system that works, it will be successful for everyone. He, of course, compares it to cricket.
Like we used to play cricket. When a player would go to play, he would not be intimidated. He would be encouraged. If he's out, then we say, go and practice a bit more. Then the team wins.
So cap and trade worked in the 90s in the US for acid rain. It is now working in India for particulate matter. Could it work for carbon dioxide? Jeff has a story about that.
For a long time, people thought, including me, thought that we could have a cap and trade program.
After a success in the US, Jeff was asked to go to Europe and promote cap and trade as a way of cutting carbon emissions.
But we made this presentation quite a few times. And I wouldn't say it was the audience, these were diplomats for the most part, so no one was hostile. But there was a lot of skepticism about the idea of giving people a license to pollute.
There was an idea that soon there would be an international system for controlling CO2 emissions.
if you assume that's going to be the case, that you're going to have something, a cap and trade program is the least costly way of doing it for all the reasons that we've already talked about, unless you can have a carbon tax. But people thought it would be more politically acceptable.
There are, in theory, an infinite number of ways to handle carbon dioxide. The world still hasn't nailed it. Two main ones are worth discussing. There's a cap and trade system with a market like the one Jeff described. The last time politicians tried to introduce a U.S. carbon market, in 2009, it didn't pass. That's the bill Michael mentioned that died in the Senate when he was working in the Obama White House. And then there's a carbon tax, charging companies that emit carbon dioxide a fee for every ton that they emit. Jeff says that's not going to happen.
So a carbon tax is just politically, people don't like taxes. And it's become so vilified that I think even though you have the policy community and economists and even most environmental groups support the idea of a carbon tax, many industry groups support the idea of a carbon tax. But it's so easy to vilify and demonize because it's a tax and it's going to raise costs on people.
This is the quandary we are in.
On the one hand, we have very thoughtful people saying we have to reach net zero by such and such a date to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. But what do you do if that's just not politically feasible? Do you just throw up your hands and not do anything? Or do you try to come up with a compromise that moves you in that direction? I don't think legislation is possible that imposes a cost of $300 per ton on CO2 emissions. That would be, I think, economically and politically unsustainable.
So we're back to cap and trade for carbon. Since his start at the White House, Jeff has become a significant environmental lawyer, part of lawsuits related to the Clean Air Act and advising senators on the side of coal companies. Environmentalists credit Jeff with killing efforts to have a cap and trade system on carbon, and even the EPA's ability to regulate carbon under the Clean Air Act. Jeff has actually testified, drafted laws, and made phone calls to keep carbon dioxide off the list of things the Clean Air Act regulates.
What I would say is EPA shouldn't be regulating carbon dioxide under the current Clean Air Act, because the Clean Air Act was never designed to deal with CO2. CO2 is different than other pollutants because there isn't a control technology.
In other words, there's no scrubber for carbon dioxide like there was for sulfur dioxide. In the version of cap and trade that he worked on,
you weren't fundamentally changing the way that you produced electricity. You were not sort of fundamentally changing your economy. You were still burning coal, you were still burning, but you were just installing pollution controls. The only practical way to reduce CO2 emissions is to stop using fossil fuels to produce energy. But it's not an exaggeration to say we owe, to a very large extent, our standard of living on the fact that we have cheap and abundant fossil fuels. And that's how most of our electricity is produced. That's how almost all of our transportation is powered, is with fossil fuels. And so regulating CO2 is just a completely different challenge than regulating other pollutants.
Jeff doesn't have a problem with regulating CO2. He has a problem with doing it under this specific law. He's a lawyer. I asked Jeff, how do we grapple with the fact that it looks like we're not going to have climate laws that directly take on carbon dioxide?
Oh, I'm not sure that's true. I'm optimistic that we'll have climate legislation, not in this Congress, and probably not under this administration. But I do a lot of work for big energy companies, and I think they would all like to have some long-term certainty, but they're not willing to pay just anything, any amount for that certainty, right? And so I think there'll need to be compromises. I do think that there should be some sort of climate change legislation, but ultimately, climate change is a global problem. And it always seemed to me that what we should be most focused on is regulatory programs and incentives that are likely to develop technologies that will be cost effective and that could be implemented throughout the world. Because if all we do is increase the cost of energy in the United States, but if that's the only way to do it, it's going to be very hard to see how India and China and Southeast Asia, so ultimately I think climate change will be solved through technology development. And I think there are some promising things on the horizon.
Jeff is talking about more technological innovation. But this has been a story about innovation that doesn't come from technology, but more just thinking about human nature. I wanted to talk to Michael about Jeff's story and the current state of pollution controls in the U.S. Here's that conversation. You know, my conversation with Jeff really struck me as being from another time of certainly the Republican Party, but also just sort of our society. And what I mean by that, of course, is Jeff is talking about a Republican Party that is really concerned about environmental issues and wanting to do things in the government to protect the environment. And we're not seeing that today, right? We're seeing a focus instead on energy dominance and releasing regulations and all that stuff. And so it got me thinking, is that Republican Party forever in the past? Are we on a linear path to something different? Or is it more like a pendulum and it'll swing back someday? And my thinking now is we're either on a linear path and that's in the past, or the pendulum is so big that the swing back will happen when we're long dead.
Okay, well, thank you for the happy introduction. Yes, I had a very similar reaction listening to Jeff. It felt like a postcard from a beautiful past. You had either party, very interested in continuing economic growth and very interested in addressing environmental quality. And both of those things are important for our well-being. And they went down to the technocratic mind, found the right tool called the cap and trade market, and applied it. And it did exactly what it was supposed to do. And, you know, it's a sidebar, such a beautiful victory for economics. There's so few victories for economics, but that was cap and trade is like, that's in the Hall of Fame of victories for economics. But yeah, it was a postcard from the past. I occasionally get invited to little small conferences. They kind of feel like they're in the dark or in some cave where the Bush people or the small C conservative people get together and talk about the revolution and how cap and trade is about to come back. And how can we do it? But, you know, honestly, it feels like we're on a little island way out to sea, and there's no one coming to rescue us. But it is fun to talk about what could be. And I'm always struck when I leave those, man, that was fun. And wow, pollution markets can be so successful. But in the U.S. context, at the national level, there's just not much appetite for it.
You know, one thing that also struck me with Jeff's comments is, you know, it got me thinking about the endangerment finding, which is a bit of a wonky term, but it is essentially a scientific finding that concludes carbon dioxide endangers the public health and welfare, and EPA should evaluate whether or not to regulate it. In terms of the definition, it's a very big deal. It happened in 2009. It was the legal underpinning piece for all of the regulations that the Obama administration and others tried to pursue for climate change and regulations. And now the Trump administration, the EPA under President Trump is going through the process to undo that finding, which will open up a very significant debate about the severity of climate change. And, you know, I think somebody like Jeff, who is a very reasonable, smart guy, you know, makes some comments that, you know, he sounds like he might agree with getting rid of the endangerment finding. I actually don't know the answer to that.
So let's just start with the super personal pain, and then we can have a maybe more antiseptic reptilian conversation about it. But it was written at EPA, but I was in the White House at the time, and I contributed to it. So the pulling back of the endangerment finding feels a little personal. We at the time felt like what we were doing was summarizing the evidence. We said to each other all the time, our job is not to make evidence. We're just faceless bureaucrats. Our job is to summarize the evidence. And the notion that 15 years later, with a massive accumulation of greater evidence, that the right conclusion from that was that, in fact, climate change is not a threat to public health or welfare. On its face, it's very difficult to understand if anyone can conclude that on the level. But that is what our country's doing right now.
I struggle to think of the right thing to say there because we're living in a world where information and facts are extremely fungible. And it reminds me of an article I wrote during the first Trump administration where I said climate change is the easiest news to fake. Back when fake news was the term we used. But climate change is so complicated, right? And kind of boring, let's be honest, that it can be easy to show a lot of smart-looking charts and quotes that make it seem as if climate change isn't as big of a deal as it actually is. And so, obviously, with this process of the endangerment finding, you can't just pop up a chart on social media and call it good. Like, it will have to be a very rigorous process. So I'll be watching closely to see how it goes. And it's not insofar as we're living in this world where facts are unfortunately seemingly fungible, and we're entering an era where the debate on climate change is going to be a little bit muddled again, coming back to the swinging pendulum that we talked about. The pendulum has swung back to a place where we were around 2007, 8, 9, where people were debating climate change. And so we're coming back to that. And, let's see what the scientific process of repealing the endangerment finding looks like. It will hopefully be quite rigorous, and hopefully the science of climate change will prevail.
I'm not positive I'm going to get it right, but I think there's a book that I'm digging deep, like into college here, that I loved when I was in college, called The Cycles of American History. And I think the author was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And what he demonstrated is the pendulum doesn't swing way out start going into outer space, but that it can get pretty far out and then it starts to swing back. At least that's the history of America. That doesn't mean history is not a perfect predictor of the future, but maybe that gives you a little hope and optimism.
Yeah, sounds like I'll need to pick up that book. Jeff talked about C. Boyden Gray as being this father figure of the modern day environmental movement in the Republican Party. Do we need another C. Boyden Gray? And who would you nominate?
That's a great question. I think the country, it doesn't have to be Republican Party, Democratic Party, the country needs a C. Boyden Gray. He was this remarkable figure. So I like to talk to my graduate students about, I call them like Starbucks conversations. Those are conversations when you got an idea, you're not really sure if it's going to work, but you like to talk about it, and you talk about it really loudly, and you think it's going to be awesome. What C. Boyden Gray was not like the anti-Starbucks conversation. Like, he had the idea, knew the idea, but was super focused on the details of execution as well. And I think that's what he hired Jeff to do, was to help execute. And there's one little snippet from that, because I was fortunate enough to be at a conference, I think maybe like celebrating the 25th anniversary of the sulfur dioxide market, where C. Boyden Gray, who I had long admired, was at that conference and speaking. And so they launched the market, the sulfur dioxide market, and everyone's kind of sitting around like, is this thing going to work? Like, are any of the firms going to trade with each other? And there were like no trades. And they're like, oh my goodness, we spent all this time. We wrote the law. We're gonna get this right. And so then C. Boyden Gray was like, okay, I know what to do. And this is his telling, which I'm repeating. He's like, I'm going to call up two firms and I'm going to order them to trade with each other. And I'm going to tell them the price. And once that we do a couple of those, then this kind of thing will get escape velocity on its own. I thought that was really, really cool. But I think it illustrates we need people with ideas on in either party on this, on how to manage the need for growth and environmental quality, and excellent execution chops. He certainly personified that.
And most importantly, we need somebody else whose name is such that we have to say it in full. It has to be C. Boyden Gray. We talked about India having a cap and trade market for other types of pollution. Do you think India will get a cap and trade market for carbon dioxide before the United States?
Terrific and delicious question. I would say the odds are yes. They actually have publicly said that they're interested in having one. There's been some work in putting it together. How that gets launched and the details TBD. But will they have one before the United States? There's certainly much more momentum towards it.
I would tend to agree, as long as they see the system as being in their economic favor.
Exactly.
They don't have, at least from my vantage point, which, to be clear, is extremely uneducated on the politics of India. But from where I sit, our politics seem to be a little bit upside down, perhaps compared to the politics of India. But those politics, I understand, are also pretty complicated. So
there's one more thing I want to say about the Jeff thing. He said, well, technology should get us out of it. And I also find that I couldn't agree more, but it's like the Starbucks idea. Unless you see people taking actions to juice technology to get us out of it, then it kind of seems like a idea that will just evaporate among the vapors from the coffee machines in Starbucks.
Right. And the whole question is, well, how does the technology come about? Does regulation compel it? Does cap and trade system incentivize it? Do subsidies incentivize it? And, we've talked about this ad nauseum for our whole careers of how do you skin a cat? And there's allegedly a lot of ways to do that. And right now we're not doing anything to the cat. We're just letting it sit there.
I totally agree.
Great conversation as always. Thank you so much. And we'll see each other soon.
Take care.
Shocked is part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. It was produced by Jesse Baker and Eric Newsom of Magnificent Noise. Our production staff includes Christine Driscoll, Amy Padula, Sophie Bridges, Jamie York, and Samantha Hennig. Our sound designer is Kristen Muller. A big thanks to my co-host, Michael Greenstone, a professor at the University of Chicago and director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. He also serves as executive producer of Shocked, along with Sam Ori, the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. The Institute combines a 360-degree approach to education, frontier research, having an impact in frontline communities globally. The Institute's efforts are driven by the need to balance climate risks with societal growth. To follow or support their work, see our show notes or visit climate.uchicago.edu. For more of my reporting, you can look for me on pretty much any social media. Search Amy Harder, or look for my byline at Axios. This is Shocked. I'm your host, Amy Harder. Thanks for listening.
That was an episode of Shocked. To listen to more, search for Shocked in your podcast app or visit the show notes. I'm Hal Weitzman with the Chicago Booth Review podcast. We'll catch you next time.